The thing about warp travel is that you never stop hearing the ship breathe. And on the fourth day, the relentless contrition stopped. Mira Vale noticed the ventilation first, the way she noticed most things, obliquely, while doing something else entirely. She was charting a junior ratings fever, third day running, nothing interesting, just his body adjusting to recycled air and recycled everything else, when she became aware that she could hear the scratch of her own stylus. Not because the medicae bay was silent, because the low, constant exhalation of the ventilation cycle had dropped half a register from presence to absence, and her ears had quietly promoted the stylus to the loudest thing in the room. She noted it, filed it, moved on. This is what 4 years of battlefield medicine does to a person. It teaches you to notice everything and act on almost nothing, because the ratio of signals to genuine emergencies runs roughly 100 to 1, and if you chased every signal, you would never sleep and never stop and never be any use to anyone when the real thing arrived. Mira Vale had learned to let the small wrongnesses pool at the back of her mind like sediment, waiting to see if they accumulated into something worth naming. The medicae bay of the relentless contrition was not beautiful, but it was hers in the way that any space becomes yours after 6 months of sleeping and eating and working inside it. 2 rows of 8 cots, currently 4 occupied. A dispensary cage with a lock that required 2 keys, which she kept on the same chain because the regulation requiring them to be kept separately was written by someone who had never needed to open a dispensary cage quickly in the dark. A desk at the far end beneath a lumen strip that ran at half power during ship's night, casting everything in the particular blue-white of Imperial utility lighting. The color, she had once thought, of something being efficiently preserved rather than warmly lit. The chief medicae, Olban Kraska, had the office behind the dispensary. She could hear him in there now, the low mutter of him dictating his daily report, the pause, mutter, pause rhythm she had calibrated as ambient noise months ago. He was a reasonable man. He had reasonable expectations and reasonable opinions, and a reasonable degree of concern for his patients' welfare, and Mira had worked with worse, and occasionally with better, and had long since made her peace with the particular loneliness of being more curious than the institution that employed her. She finished the fever chart, checked the rating's temperature, down a fraction. Good. She moved to the next cot, where an engineer's mate had come in yesterday with a sprained wrist, and was sleeping with the deep indifference of the genuinely comfortable. Beyond him, 2 ratings she didn't recognize from the manifests she'd been meaning to cross-reference, both sleeping off minor lacerations from a cargo handling incident in the lower bays. Beyond them, silence and empty cots and the half-power lumen light, making everything look like it was being kept. Mira refilled her recaf from the dispenser in the corner. The dispenser on the relentless contrition produced recaf of a specific and unremarkable character. Not bad enough to complain about, not good enough to appreciate, the precise culinary equivalent of the lumen lighting. She drank it anyway. She had been drinking mediocre recaf since her 2nd year in the medicae corps, and she no longer tasted it so much as used it, the way you use a tool worn smooth by years of the same grip. She sat at her desk and opened her personal journal. Not the ship's log. She had learned on her 3rd posting, under a chief medicae with a habit of auditing the records of anyone he suspected of independent thought, that official logs were a poor place for honest observation. The journal was a physical thing, actual paper, actual ink, a habit she had maintained across 4 postings and 3 different war zones, because paper could not be remotely accessed and ink could not be corrupted. She had been teased for it by every colleague who noticed. She maintained it anyway. Day 4. Transit unremarkable. 4 patients currently in Bay. Fever, sprain, 2 lacerations from the cargo incident in Bay Secondary. Krask dictating his report, which means he's nearly done for the day. She paused. Ventilation running low, possibly a pressure adjustment. Note, check with maintenance if it persists. The recap is terrible. She closed the journal and sat for a moment in the blue-white quiet of the bay, listening to the scratch of Krask's dictation and the slow breathing of her 4 patients, and beneath it all, the newly noticeable absence of the ship's breath. It would come back. These things always resolved. She had been on vessels where the ventilation cut entirely for 6 hours during a particularly rough transit, where the air went stale and thick, and everyone moved a little slower and spoke a little less, and it had resolved, and the ship had exhaled again, and the world had continued. She finished her recap. She was, she decided, tired. Not unusually so. Just the ordinary tired of someone doing ordinary work in an ordinary situation, which was, when she was honest with herself, more than she'd had any right to expect after Vanthis 4. She did not think about Vanthis the 4th. He arrived on day 5 at 0640 before she had finished her first cup. Young, early 20s maybe, with the particular look of someone who had been doing physical work since childhood. Broad through the shoulders, hands that knew what they were for. His uniform identified him as a cargo rating, Bay Tertius assignment. He had no injury she could see. He was not moving like someone in pain. He simply walked to the nearest empty cot and sat down on its edge and looked at her with an expression of settled patience that she initially read as stoicism and later revised. "What's the complaint?" she asked, already reaching for her intake slate. He thought about this for a moment. Not the hesitation of someone searching for words, but the pause of someone who found the question mildly interesting. "No complaint," he said. "I just wanted to sit somewhere warm." Mira looked at him. He looked back, pleasant, unhurried. "The crew quarters are warm," she said. "They are," he agreed, as if this were a satisfying observation rather than a counter-argument. She ran the intake anyway. Vital signs, temperature, blood pressure, standard neurological indicators. Everything was normal. Textbook normal. The kind of normal you rarely see on a ship in warp transit, because the transit itself introduces a dozen low-grade variables that show up as minor deviations in the readings of anyone paying attention. He was a physiological ideal, which was not, in her experience, a thing that happened without reason. She checked his pupils last. Standard procedure, the final item on the intake sequence. She brought the pen light up, watched his eyes, clicked the beam on. His pupils contracted. Normally. Appropriately. She clicked it off, waited for them to dilate. They did. Slowly. Not dramatically slowly. Not the 1.5-second delay she would have flagged immediately. Not the kind of lag that made you reach for the neurological reference texts. Just slightly more slowly than they should have. Half a beat. The difference between a door closing and a door being eased shut by a careful hand. She recorded it as a possible neurological flag. Transient likely. Worth monitoring. "You can stay for a while," she said, because he clearly intended to regardless, and there was no medical justification for turning him out. "If you're due on shift." "Not until 1400, he said, with the same settled patience. She returned to her desk. He sat on the cot's edge and did not speak, and did not fidget, and did not ask for anything. After 20 minutes, he thanked her quietly and left. She noted the eye color field on his intake form. She filled it in. She moved on. 3 more came from Bay Tertius on day 6. Different faces, different builds, different ages. One of them a woman in her 40s who reminded Mira slightly of a surgeon she had trained under, though she could not have said why. They arrived at different times throughout the shift. None of them together, none of them apparently aware of each other's visit, all of them presenting with nothing. This was when she understood they were not malingering. She had seen malingering. Malingering had a specific texture, the carefully vague complaint, the eyes that tracked toward the door and back, the subtle performance of discomfort that never quite committed to a specific location or character. Malingerers were nervous. They were covering something, embarrassment usually, or the small dishonesty of wanting a break from a difficult assignment. They gave themselves away by the effort they were making not to give themselves away. These four were not making any effort at all. They answered her questions with a slight delay that was not confusion. She knew confusion, knew the flickering blankness of a mind searching its own filing system, but something more like amusement. As though her questions were charming in their specificity, as though the answers were obvious, but she was welcome to arrive at them in her own time. The woman who reminded her of her old surgical mentor sat for a while, and then, on leaving, paused at the door. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said. Mira opened her mouth to ask what she meant. The woman had already gone. She pulled all four intake records and checked the pupil response notations. She had recorded the lag in all of them. She always recorded what she observed. It was the habit of 2 decades, and the numbers were close enough to each other that she could not write off coincidence. Half a second in the first 3. 6/10 in the woman who'd reminded her of Dr. Vash. She flagged it to Krask. He heard her out with the particular quality of attention he gave to concerns that did not quite reach his threshold, but that his professionalism required him to not dismiss without engagement. He leaned back. He considered. Pupil response anomalies in early transit, he said, are documented. Gellar Field resonance creates low-level psychic background noise that can affect the autonomic nervous system in certain sensitive individuals. He said this in the tone of someone reciting something he had read once and found adequate. It's worth keeping an eye on, but I wouldn't flag it to the command crew. We'd be filing reports every transit if minor neurological variance was a command-level concern. He was not wrong. She knew he was not wrong. The research he was citing existed. She had read it herself. The explanation was adequate. It covered the data. She almost accepted it. Instead, she went back to her desk, wrote up a summary of all 4 visits in her personal journal, and told herself she was being thorough rather than anxious. These were different things. She knew the difference. Day 6. 4 patients from Bay Tertius, all presenting asymptomatically. Pupil response lag noted across all 4. Flagged to Krask. He attributes it to Gellar Field resonance. Plausible. Will monitor. She paused. Added, "The air in the lower decks smells different. Not bad. Something organic. Sweet, almost." Made a note to check the recycler filters in Section C. She set down her stylus. The bay was quiet. The lumen strip at half power, the 4 current patients sleeping. Krask had gone home for the night cycle. Outside the viewport, a small, thick rectangle of reinforced glass that showed nothing but the grey non-light of the Immaterium pressing against the hull. The warp did its ancient business of being incomprehensible, and she did not look at it, which was the correct protocol, and also the one she had followed since her first transit, without needing to be told. She was describing the first cargo ratings face in her notes, trying to reconstruct it as a medical exercise, because she always made a point of remembering patients, when she realized she could not remember his eye color. This did not alarm her immediately. Memory was not perfect. She had looked at a lot of eyes today. She checked the intake form. The eye color field was blank. She stared at this. She had a policy, a personal, non-negotiable policy, the kind of small professional discipline that accumulated into competence over years, of always recording eye color. It was the first identifying feature that changed in many neurological conditions. It was the detail that distinguished one patient from another in a busy bay. She recorded it automatically, the way she recorded temperature and blood pressure, because the habit was so deep it did not require thought. She did not remember leaving it blank. She did not remember filling it in either, but she always filled it in, which meant she must have, which meant she had filled it in and then, what? Written over it. But there was nothing there. No ink, no correction. Just the empty field, as clean as if she had never touched it. She set the intake form down on the desk. She picked up her stylus. She noticed her hand was very still, which was how her hands behaved when the rest of her was not. And in that stillness, she became aware, with the slow and certain quality of something that had been true for a while before she noticed it, that the ventilation cycle was not running low, not running reduced, not running at all. The ship was not breathing. She could not have said when it had stopped. She had been sitting at this desk for, she checked the chronometer, 2 hours and 17 minutes. She could not locate the moment within that stretch when the silence had begun, because it had apparently arrived the way all significant silences do, by making itself unremarkable, by becoming the room's new normal before she had the chance to object. 2 hours and 17 minutes, alone in the bay, a blank field in a form she always filled in, a face she could not reconstruct. 4 men in the lower decks sleeping peacefully in a cargo bay that had no business being warm enough to seek out. The most frightening thought she'd had in 4 years of war, and she couldn't entirely explain why. She sat in the silence that had swallowed 2 hours without her permission, and she held the intake form with its blank eye color field, and she listened very carefully to a ship that had stopped breathing, and she waited to hear it start again. It didn't. Chapter 2, What the Body Knows. By day 8, 17 crew members from Cargo Bay Tertius had visited the medicae bay for no reason they could name, and every single one of them smelled faintly of something flowering that had no business existing in recycled air. Mira had built the case file the way she built all her case files, quietly, without authorization, and with the specific thoroughness of someone who had learned that the difference between a pattern and a coincidence was usually just the number of data points you were willing to collect before deciding. She had a ship diagram pinned to the inside of her locker door, the kind of schematic that came standard in every officer's welcome packet, and that most officers folded once and filed and never looked at again. She had marked Bay Tertius in red ink. She had drawn lines from it to the medicae bay, 1 for each patient, dated and numbered. 17 lines. The diagram looked like something trying to reach something. She had cross-referenced the patient list against the crew manifest. 23 of the 17 were assigned to Bay Tertius. The remaining 4 had assignments elsewhere: engineering, a galley posting, 1 junior administratum scribe. She had no memory of seeing before, and whose name she checked against the manifest twice, because the manifest listed him as having boarded at Cypra Mundi, but his face was unfamiliar, in the way that a face is unfamiliar when you suspect you should know it. She filed this. She did not yet know what to do with it. What she did know how to do was read maintenance logs. Bay Tertius's ventilation subsection had been isolated 8 days ago, 3 days before the first patient arrived, 1 day after the transit began, for what the log described as a routine pressure check. The log entry was dated. The completion entry did not exist. 8 days, and no one had signed off on the work. No one had filed a repair report. No one had reopened the subsection. The ventilation in Bay Tertius was, on paper, still suspended pending a check that had apparently never happened. She needed the internal bay logs to go further. The internal bay logs required bosun clearance. Kyle Thross had bosun clearance. He also had, she had established over 6 months of adjacency, the kind of mind that disliked unanswered questions about ship systems with an almost physical intensity, the way some people disliked an unlocked door. She found him in the secondary corridor off the engine maintenance passage, which was where he spent his free hours when he wasn't sleeping, because he was the kind of person whose free hours and working hours were separated mainly by whether he was being paid for what he was doing. He was running a diagnostic on a pressure valve that was, as far as Mira could tell, already working perfectly. He did this, she had learned when he was thinking. "I need bosun access to the Bay Tertius internal logs," she said, because she had found that Cale responded better to direct statements than to the kind of careful preamble that other people sometimes required. He looked at her over the valve. "Why?" She told him. Not everything. Not the case file in her locker. Not the full scope of what she had been cataloguing for 2 days. But the outline. 17 patients presenting asymptomatically. Pupil lag across all of them, increasing with each visit. The ventilation anomaly. The smell. He was quiet for a moment in the way that Cale was quiet when he was genuinely processing rather than waiting for her to finish. Then he said, "The smell could be the ventilation. If the subsection's been sitting isolated for 8 days, with whatever was in the air when they sealed it, you'd get biological accumulation, especially in a cargo bay." "I know," she said, "and pupil lag in transit isn't—" "I know what Krask said." Another pause. He set down the diagnostic tool. "I don't believe your theory," he said, in a tone that made clear this was a preliminary position rather than a conclusion. "But if the ventilation log is running that far overdue, that's a systems issue regardless of everything else." He reached for his access card. "I'll pull the log. We'll see what's there." What was there was a single line, repeating. They stood at the log terminal in the secondary maintenance hub, Cale's clearance card still warm in the reader, and watched the screen scroll. Every 2 to 3 seconds, a new entry populated the log. No timestamp variation. All of them carrying the identical timestamp of the moment the subsection was isolated 8 days ago, as though the log had frozen at that moment and was simply insisting over and over that it had not. Every entry read the same word. Nominal, nominal, nominal. Kyle stared at this for a long time. He had the expression of someone watching a familiar system do something it was structurally incapable of doing. "That's not a glitch," he said finally. "No," Mira agreed. "A glitch produces garbage data, random values. This is—" He stopped. She watched him not finish the sentence, watched him decide not to name what it was, because naming it would require him to take a position he wasn't ready to take yet. "Will you come with me to the bay?" she asked. He looked at her. He looked at the screen, still scrolling its single word into the dark. "Yes," he said. The smell reached them before the door did. It was not unpleasant. That was the first thing. Mira had been expecting something biological, and therefore expecting something that her body would want to move away from. The sharp chemical signal of infection, the heavy organic weight of decay, the particular wrongness that living tissue produces when it is doing something it was not designed to do. She had spent 4 years around bodies in various states of damage, and she knew the vocabulary of the smell of harm. This was not that. It was warm. It was sweet in the way that certain tropical flowers were sweet. She had encountered that smell once, in a botanic archive on Scintilla, a room full of specimens from worlds she would never visit, and she had stood in it for longer than she intended, because something about it bypassed the analytical layer of her brain entirely, and reached something older and simpler that just registered. Good. This was that, but stronger, and underneath it, deeper than the sweetness, something else. Dense and living and vast, like the smell of a forest after rain, like the smell of a great many things breathing in a small space. Kyle had gone slightly still beside her. She noted this and filed it. The bay door was unlocked. It opened inward on a space that was large enough to lose a transit shuttle in. 3 tiers of cargo containers running the length of the ship's lower midsection, lumen strips at quarter power, the stacked geometry of crates and containers casting long shadows across a floor that should have been empty at this hour. It was not empty. They were not gathered. She registered this immediately because gathering would have been easier to categorize. A meeting had a structure, a center, a purpose that could be identified and addressed. These people were simply present, the way furniture is present in a room. Some sleeping against the base of containers, legs stretched, faces soft. Some sitting with their backs to the wall, not talking, not doing anything that she could have named. A few moving slowly between the rows, with the unhurried purposelessness of people who had nowhere to be and were content to remain that way. No one was afraid. No one registered their entry with anything but mild, welcoming acknowledgement. A few faces turned toward them as the door opened. A few small nods, the greeting of people who had been expecting company and found its arrival gratifying. Mira counted. She counted twice because the first number didn't match the manifest, and she needed to be certain. 31 people in this bay. The manifest listed 11 assigned here. The first cargo rating, day 4, the one who had wanted somewhere warm, the one whose eye color she could not remember, came toward them from the far end of the bay. Not quickly, with the measured, relaxed movement of someone crossing a room to greet a friend. He looked at Mira with an expression of uncomplicated pleasure and extended his right hand. Palm up, slightly open, an offering rather than a demand. "I'm glad you came," he said. His voice was the same as she remembered, low, unhurried, that half-beat quality to it. "It's warmer in here." She did not take his hand. She made herself not take it, which was different from not wanting to, and the difference surprised her. He was not offended. He lowered his hand without any change in expression, and the smile remained. Patient, settled, as though her refusal was simply one step in a process that had several more, as though her eventual understanding were already factored in. Cale's hand had found her arm just above the elbow. Not grabbing, just contact, brief and firm, the way you touch someone when you want them to know you are where they are. 31, he said very quietly, for her alone. "I know," she said. "I'm going to check the aft partition." He released her arm. "Don't take anything anyone offers you." She almost said "I know" again, and then didn't, because what she felt in response to that instruction was not the mild affront of someone being told what they already knew. It was something closer to gratitude. The warning was for her, yes, but it was also for him. He was reminding both of them at the same time, because he was smart enough to know they both needed it. She took out her intake slate and moved through the bay with clinical deliberation, cataloging, because that was what she was here to do, and because doing it kept her hands occupied and her mind in its professional register. She counted faces. She cross-referenced what she could against the mental manifest she had memorized. She made notes about posture, about the quality of the sleep she was observing in those who were sleeping, about the smell, which was stronger here in specific locations. Near the aft partition, near a cluster of containers in the bay's northeast corner that had no cargo designation visible on their faces. No one stopped her. No one followed her or crowded her or spoke to her again. They simply continued being present, warm and unhurried, and let her move among them like a question they had already decided to let her answer in her own time. Kyle found her at the aft partition 11 minutes later. His face had the quality she associated with people who had seen something that had restructured their understanding and hadn't yet decided what to build in its place. He said nothing. He tilted his head toward the door. She followed him out. They made it to the upper corridor before either of them spoke. "Report it," Kyle said. He was not walking quickly, but there was a quality to his movement that was more directed than usual, the walk of someone routing himself deliberately away from something. "Report it now, tonight, to the captain. Isolate the bay. Let command make the call. And when command makes the same call Krask made, then command has made the call and we have done our jobs." He stopped, turned to look at her with the directness he deployed when he wanted to make sure something was received rather than just heard. "Mira, what's your plan? Keep gathering data until you have enough for an argument no one can dismiss. On a ship in warp transit." He let that sit for a moment. "Whatever's in that bay, we don't understand it yet. That means we don't know what the right response is, which means the right response is to get more eyes on it. The eyes we have on it right now belong to a chief medicae who cited standard references and went home for the night cycle. She heard the edge in her own voice and did not file it away. It was accurate data. I need to understand the mechanism, Kale. I can't argue for containment with anomalous pupil responses and a smell. I need... Mira. He said her name in a way that stopped her. Not loud, not hard, just certain, with the specific weight of someone who has decided to say the true thing. Those people in there weren't afraid of us. She was quiet. "You know what that means for containment," he said. "You know what it means that 31 people in that bay, 20 of whom have no assignment there, are sleeping peacefully in the middle of ship's night, and not one of them looked at us like we were a threat. Not one of them looked at us like we were anything except..." He stopped. "Like we were expected." She knew what he meant. She had known it from the moment the first cargo rating had offered her his open hand. She had simply not wanted to have known it, because the implications required a vocabulary she had no training for. Her training was for the body she could read. What she had seen in that bay was the body speaking a language she didn't have. "Let me look at the data I have," she said. "One more day. If I can establish progression, if I can show this is moving through the crew in a pattern that supports what we're both thinking, then we go to the captain together, with evidence." He looked at her for a long moment, the look of someone calculating whether trust was appropriate and deciding with reservations that it was. "One day," he said, "and then we go regardless of what you've found." She nodded. He walked away down the corridor, and she watched him go, and she thought about what he'd said. "Weren't afraid of us," and felt the shape of it settle into the sediment at the back of her mind, where all the signals pooled. The pupil data was worse than she'd expected. She laid all 17 intake records across the desk in chronological order and read the response times like a temperature chart, the kind of chart you made when you were tracking the progression of something that had a direction. The first patient, half a second, the next 2, similar, then a steady, gradual increase. The most recent patient who had come in yesterday afternoon, 2 full seconds. 2 seconds between the stimulus and the response, a gap wide enough to feel. She plotted it on a graph. The line went one direction. She began writing a formal report. She was 3 pages in. Patient list, intake data, the ventilation anomaly, the bay head count, the nominal log. When she stopped. Not because she didn't know what else to write, because she had reached the line on the page that read, "Recommended action, report to," and had stared at it for 60 seconds without being able to fill in the blank. The captain, whom she had not seen since the transit began and whose location she realized she could not account for. The navigator, sealed in their sanctum by protocol, unreachable without command authority. The Gellar Field operators, psychers, isolated. The Engineer Prime. She knew the Engineer Prime's name only from the crew manifest. She sat back and thought about which of these people had been to Bay Tertius in the past 8 days, and found that she did not know, and found further that not knowing was its own kind of data. She left the report open on her desk. She put on her coat. She picked up her sample kit. She needed a tissue sample, something she could put under the scope, something that existed in the realm of the cellular and the measurable, something that would give her a mechanism rather than a pattern. She had the names of 4 of the patients who had most recently visited the bay, the ones with the longest pupil lag, and she knew from their intake records that at least 2 of them had returned to Bay Tertius after their visit rather than to their assigned quarters. She told herself this was a clinical decision. She told herself the same thing she always told herself when she went back to a thing she knew she should approach carefully. That she was the most qualified person to do this, that she was doing it correctly, and that understanding was always better than not understanding. She was right about all 3. It did not help. Bay Tertius at night cycle was quieter than it had been. More of them were sleeping. The smell was a presence rather than a note, thick and warm and resident, the smell of a place that had become fully inhabited. She moved carefully, professionally, into the space between containers, and she found what she was looking for. A man sleeping against the aft wall, his breathing slow and even, his face carrying the smoothed-out expression of someone in a sleep without anxiety in it. She took the sample. Clean, quick, minimal disturbance. His breathing didn't change. She capped the vial. She turned toward the door. She was 6 steps from it when someone said her name. Her first name. Not medicae vial, not doctor. The name her mother had used. The name her regiment colleagues had used, on Vanthis 4, in the particular register of people who are about to die and want the last thing they say to be something true. She stopped. She turned around. The lights at quarter power. The smell, warm and flowering and present. The long shadows of the container rose, and within them, between them, faces. How many, she couldn't have said. She had stopped counting. All oriented toward her with the identical expression she had been cataloguing for 2 days. Welcoming, patient, warm. The door was 6 steps behind her. She had counted them on the way in. She was a medicae. She always counted exits. The first cargo rating was there, somewhere near the center of the space, not moving toward her, just present, his expression unchanged from the bay visit, and unchanged from the medica bay visit, and unchanged. She understood now. From the expression she had not been able to reconstruct when she tried to remember his face. This was the face. She was seeing it now, and she understood that she would not be able to hold it afterward, that it was the kind of face that didn't leave marks. He did not move toward her. Neither did any of them. They simply waited in the warmth and the dark, with a patience that had no bottom to it. At 0300, Cale Thross walked past the medicae bay and saw the light. He had not been sleeping. He had been lying in his bunk thinking about nominal, scrolling on a screen, and about 31 people who had no reason to be in a bay, and about the specific feeling of a ship that was very quiet in a way that a ship should not be quiet. And eventually he had gotten up, because lying still had started to feel like a form of complicity. The medicae bay light was on. He had learned over 6 months that this meant Mira was working, and he told himself it was good that she was working, and he told himself he was checking on her as a professional courtesy, and not because of anything else. He pushed the door open. The bay was empty. Not disheveled, not disturbed. Everything precisely as she would have left it. The neat professional discipline, of someone who maintained order in their workspace the way others maintained order in their minds. The lumen at half power, the patients in their cots, sleeping, the desk clear except for 3 pages of a formal report, and the open journal with its last entry visible in Mira's precise, slightly too small handwriting. I think I understand now why they keep coming back. He stood very still and read it twice. Her pen light was on the floor beside the desk. He picked it up. It was on. She had not clicked it off, which was unlike her, which was the kind of small deviation that in 6 months of knowing her, he had never once observed. He held it for a moment. The beam was still bright. The habit was old and automatic, the kind of thing voidsmen did after odd nights in warp transit, a quick self-check. He brought the beam up, clicked it on and off. His pupils contracted, responded, returned. He turned off the pen light and set it on the desk beside the journal. He looked at the report she had been writing, at the 3 careful pages of it, at the blank line that read, "Recommended action, report to." He would finish it for her. He would take it to the captain in the morning. He would handle this correctly. He walked to the door. He felt as he reached it that the bay was slightly warmer than it had been when he entered. The thought lasted half a second before it dissolved into the low background frequency of everything else he was carrying. He did not think to check the delay. In the cot nearest the door, the junior rating sleeping off his fever turned over and was still. Outside in the corridor the ship was very quiet, and Cale Thross walked through it alone, carrying a problem he now thought was his to solve. And behind him in the medicae bay, the light stayed on. Chapter 3. 17 Ways a Ship Can Lie. Kyle had sailed 17 warp transits and survived them all by trusting 3 things: the ship's voice, his own hands, and the principle that if you understood a system well enough, it could not betray you. On day 10, all 3 were gone. He had started working at 400, which was not unusual for him. What was unusual was the reason. Normally he worked early, because early was when the ship was honest, before the day shift populated the corridors with noise and opinion, and the particular kind of incompetence that required his intervention, before the bureaucratic layer of the relentless contrition's daily operation descended like sediment over the things that actually mattered. Early was when he could hear the ship think, the low harmonic of the drives, the specific pressure sigh of the bulkheads in Section D that had been running 3 millibars low since Cypra Mundi, and that he had logged twice and intended to fix personally when he found a 6-hour window. The rhythm of the ventilation in the upper corridors, which ran at a slightly different tempo from the lower decks, because someone in the original construction had used 2 different manufacturers for the fan assemblies and no one had ever corrected it. He knew all of this. He had accumulated it the way you accumulated anything that mattered, slowly, through attention, over years. He knew this ship's voice. He had learned it across 6 months of service and cross-referenced it against every other vessel he had served on, because every ship had a voice, and the voice changed when something was wrong, and the ability to hear the difference was, in his view, the single most valuable skill a voidsman could develop. More valuable than strength, more valuable than courage, more valuable even than the encyclopedic technical knowledge he had spent 17 transits building, because the knowledge told you what could go wrong, and the voice told you when it had. He was at his duty station in the secondary systems hub, running a manual check on the pressure array in Section C, when he acknowledged to himself that the reason he had started at 0400 was not the ship. It was Mira's journal. It was 4 words in her handwriting that he had been carrying since 0300, like a weight distributed unevenly, the kind that shifted when you stopped moving and reminded you it was there. I think I understand now. He worked. Working was what he did when thinking alone wasn't sufficient. and action wasn't yet possible. He checked the pressure array. He logged the Section D bulkhead again with a note that now read, "Third log. Requires immediate correction." He ran the thermal diagnostic on the drive section that Engineer Vorath had been deferring for 2 weeks. He did this with the thorough, unhurried competence of someone who had decided to be useful until the moment came to be something else. He had been doing this for approximately 90 minutes when the pressure readings stopped agreeing with each other. It was subtle at first, a 2-point variance between the primary and secondary sensors in Section F, which shared a manifold and should therefore have been reading within a fraction of identical. 2 points was inside the error margin. He noted it and moved on. Then 3 points in Section G. Then the primary sensor in Section H reading higher than its secondary by a margin that was outside the error range and inside the range of early pipe stress, which would have been a straightforward maintenance flag, except that the Section H pipework had been replaced entirely 8 months ago at Cypra Mundi and showed no stress indicators in any other diagnostic. He pulled the thermal data. The thermal data was worse. There was a heat signature in Corridor 7 Bravo that had no source. Not a large signature, not the kind that tripped the automated hazard systems, but consistent and warm and shaped when he looked at the overlay, like something occupying the corridor rather than emanating from its walls. The shape of it was approximately the size and temperature distribution of a human body, except the corridor was listed as empty on every manifest and every proximity sensor he checked. He ran it again. The corridor was empty. The heat was there. He found 4 more. Different locations. Same character. Body-sized. Body temperature. Present in spaces the ship's systems insisted contained nothing. He plotted them on his section diagram and looked at where they were and felt something in his chest make a decision that his mind had not yet formally reached. 3 of them were between the upper corridors and Bay Tertius. He opened the crew manifest. Habit, procedure. When you found an anomaly in a ship's systems, you cross-referenced against the crew data to look for the human variable. The manifest loaded. He ran a location check. The first discrepancy took him a moment to identify, because it was small and the manifest was large, and his eyes wanted to file it as a display error. A rating named Sorvek, assigned to engineering, listed as present in Engineering Bay 2. Also listed as present in Bay Tertius. Same timestamp on both entries. He checked the system. The system was not malfunctioning. Both entries were valid. The timestamp was accurate. The system was telling him, with complete confidence, that Sorvek was in 2 places at the same time. He checked 4 more names, the same, then 11. Then he stopped checking names, because he had understood by that point that the number was not the question he needed to be asking. The Gellar Field Operator's Station occupied a section of the ship that Cale visited rarely and left quickly when he did. This was not cowardice. He was precise about the distinction, but the reasonable response of an unaugmented human nervous system to prolonged exposure to an environment designed for psychers. The air near the station had a quality that the technical manuals described as elevated psychic resonance, and that Cale's body described as the sustained sensation of standing too close to something very large that was paying attention to him. He went anyway, because the field operators were the only people on this ship who had a professional obligation to know what was coming through the hull, and he needed to know what they knew. There were 3 of them. He had worked alongside their kind on 4 previous vessels and had arrived at a position of professional respect that he was honest enough to acknowledge contained a component of unease he had never fully resolved. The lead operator was young, younger than he expected every time, because the work aged them in ways that showed in the eyes before anywhere else, and her eyes were old. Her name was Cass. She had the specific stillness of someone who spent most of their working hours attending to things no one else in the room could perceive. She told him the field was holding at 94% integrity without him asking. She said it the way you said something to preempt a question you had been expecting. 94 is within parameters, he said. Yes. Where's the other 6%? She looked at him with those old eyes and said, It's not lost. It keeps redistributing to the same point. I've been correcting it manually, every 4 hours. He felt the weight shift in his chest. How long? Since day 3. He was quiet for a moment. The station hummed around him with its particular resonant frequency, the one that pressed very gently against the base of his skull. And you've been correcting it manually for 7 days. Yes. Without sleeping. A pause that was not quite confirmation and not quite denial. The field holds, she said. That's what matters. What's at the point it keeps redistributing to? She looked at him steadily. Bay Tertius. He had known. He had known before he asked, and the knowing did not make hearing it easier. He asked the last question because it needed to be on record, somewhere, in someone's account of how this had gone. Why wasn't the command crew informed? We informed the captain, she said. The captain was informed on day 4. He thanked her. He left. Behind him, as the door closed, he heard the soft, repetitive sound of her returning to her work. A low, rhythmic murmur that might have been calibration and might have been something that kept her anchored to herself in a room that pressed on the mind from all directions. He did not look back. He found the captain outside Bay Tertius, not inside, not approaching or departing, standing in the corridor that ran along the bay's sealed exterior wall, facing the door, approximately 2 meters back from it, not moving, not doing anything that Cale's categories of normal behavior had a word for. Cale said his name. Nothing. Said it again, louder. The captain did not move, did not turn, did not register the sound with any change in posture or breathing that Cale could detect. He walked up and put his hand on the captain's shoulder. The captain turned. Smooth, unhurried, the rotation of someone interrupted in a private thought rather than startled from a standing sleep. He looked at Cale with an expression that was recognizably the captain's expression. He had seen it in briefings, at the officers' table, on the command deck during difficult transits, and also underneath it, or perhaps behind it, something else that did not belong there. A quality of settled warmth that the captain had never, in Cale's experience, possessed. Thros, he said pleasantly, is there something you need? Cale looked at him directly. He brought nothing up to check, no penlight, nothing clinical. He simply looked, the way you looked at a system you were trying to diagnose, and he watched the captain's eyes in the overhead lumen light, and he counted. 1, 2, 2.5 seconds before the pupils responded. Just checking in, sir, he said. Good man, the captain said with the warmth. Carry on. Cale walked away. He did not walk quickly. He took the route to the command deck that ran through the most populated sections of the upper ship, past the officers' mess and the secondary helm station and the communications array because he was thinking about the thermal signatures in the corridors, and he wanted to be in sight of other people, and he wanted to be looking at their faces. Every face he passed was fine. He locked the command deck door from inside and sat down at the primary systems console and told himself he was not afraid. He was not, precisely. What he was a man who had spent 17 warp transits accumulating the certainty that competence was sufficient and who was beginning to revise that position against his will. The movement data was the worst thing he had ever seen on a ship's log, and he had seen a lot of ship's logs. He pulled 6 days of crew movement records, position pings from personal Vox beads, proximity sensor logs, access card readers, the dozen overlapping systems that a vessel used to know where its crew was at any given moment. He compiled it into the three-dimensional ship diagram his station could render, and he ran the playback from day 4 forward, and he watched. For the first day, it was normal. The fractal randomness of 240 people going about their lives. The overlapping, purposeless, beautiful entropy of a community in motion. People going to mess and coming back. People visiting colleagues and changing their minds halfway there. People taking the long route because they were avoiding someone, or the short route because they were tired, or standing in the corridor for a moment, for no reason at all, because they were human, and humans did that. By day 6, something had changed. It was not the movements of everyone. It was the movements of the people who had been to Bay Tertius, threaded through the larger pattern like a different kind of thread. The same color nearly, but with a different texture when you looked closely. They moved with direction, not hurried, not conspicuous, just directed, as though each path had been decided before the person had decided to take it. And the paths were not random. When he looked at them across 6 days, when he let his eyes find the shape beneath the individual movements, he saw it the way you saw a shape in clouds, suddenly, and then impossible to unsee. They were growing outward from Bay Tertius, not clustering, not converging, growing like roots from a seed, or like blood from a wound, extending through the ship's corridors in slow, deliberate radiations that were not yet everywhere but were, unmistakably, heading there. The directed crew members were moving through the ship in patterns that would, if continued, eventually touch every section, every mess, every bunk room, every station. He sat with this for a long time, long enough for the command deck to settle into its ambient sounds around him, the drive harmonics, the climate systems, the soft chatter of the communications array receiving nothing, and for his mind to move through the shape of the problem and out the other side into the territory where the shape of the response lived. He had a plan. He had always been better with plans than with fear, which was perhaps the same skill operating in different directions. The navigator. The navigator was the only person on this ship with the authority and the ability to pull them out of the warp before the transit was complete. An emergency exit was not clean. It carried risks, the kind that showed up in casualty reports as transit trauma and warp-related fatalities, and the occasional vessel lost to a badly executed re-entry. But it was survivable. It was categorically survivable, which was more than he could currently say for the alternative. He would go to the navigator's sanctum. He would present the data. He would make the argument, and the argument was good, and the navigator would hear it. He stood up. He crossed the command deck to the door. The door did not open. He tried the manual release. He tried the override code. He stood in front of a sealed door that had been opened 12 minutes ago, when he had locked it from inside, and that was now sealed from outside, and he listened, and he heard nothing in the corridor beyond. No footsteps, no voices, no sound of anyone who had done this and stayed to observe it. He went back to his station. He checked his hands, steady, his breathing, controlled. He ran through 17 transits in the compressed way his memory had always been able to access them. Not chronologically, but by problem type. Every system failure and near miss and human error that had required his intervention. The full catalogue of ways a ship could go wrong and the responses that had worked. None of them addressed this. He sat still and thought about Mira's journal, and about Nominal scrolling on a log, and about 31 people sleeping peacefully in a bay that should have held 11, and about the captain's eyes counting to 2.5 before they caught the light. And then he noticed the smell. Warm, sweet, faintly floral, the ghost of something that had no business in recycled air. He had been in the sealed command deck for approximately 3 hours. He had not noticed the smell when he arrived. He noticed it now. He sat with the implications of that for the length of time it took to breathe in and breathe out once. And then he thought, with the particular clarity that comes just before everything stops mattering, that he had been very wrong about the three things he trusted. The ship had not betrayed him. He had simply misunderstood what the ship was. The door opened. It opened from outside, smoothly, without drama. The sound of a seal releasing and a handle turning. The mundane mechanical sound of a door being opened by a hand that had the means to open it. Light from the corridor beyond, and in the light a small woman in ecclesiarchy robes, holding a portable lumen at chest height, her face cast in its upward glow with the calm of someone who had decided before arriving how this conversation would go. Behind her, at a distance that suggested he had chosen it himself, a boy, 19 perhaps, thin, with the look of someone who had been running on insufficient sleep for days and whose body had decided that fear was now the primary fuel source. He was pressing himself slightly against the corridor wall, not hiding. There was nowhere to hide, but maintaining the maximum distance available to him from everything in all directions simultaneously. He was terrified. It was the most straightforward emotion Cale had seen on a human face in days, and the relief of it was so acute, it was almost painful. Prioress Aldwin Sura looked at Cale with eyes that had been doing their own calculations, and said, "How long have you been in there?" Kyle opened his mouth. He looked at the command deck chronometer. He looked at it because it was what you did, because time was a system and systems had answers, and the number on it landed in his mind and would not resolve into anything coherent. He looked at the last timestamp in his system log. He looked at the chronometer again. 17 warp transits. He knew this ship's voice the way he knew his own heartbeat. He could not reconcile what the chronometer said with what he remembered. He looked at the prioress. He looked at the boy pressed against the wall behind her, breathing too fast, eyes moving to every shadow in the corridor, with the absolute vigilance of someone who had not yet stopped being afraid. "I don't know," Kyle said. It was the first true thing he had said out loud in 3 hours. It felt like something giving way. Chapter 4. The Shape of Warmth. Prioress Aldwin Sura had administered last rites to 412 people. She had always known what to say. On day 11, she found 39 of those people standing in a cargo bay, smiling at her, and she had nothing. Her thoughts moved in liturgical time. This was not a choice she had made. It was what 40 years of devotional practice had done to the architecture of her mind, the way a river reshapes its own bank. She did not think in straight lines. She thought in call and response, in the cadenced back and forth of prayer that had been the structure of every significant moment of her life since she was 22 years old, and a senior confessor had placed his hand on her head and said the words that ended her former self and began this one. She had been aware something was wrong since day 6. She had not said so to anyone, because her awareness had not yet taken a form that language could carry cleanly. What she had was a feeling, and she was suspicious of feelings in the way that people who have spent their lives in service to something larger than themselves become suspicious of their own interiority. Feelings were not nothing, but they required corroboration before they warranted action. She had spent 5 days seeking corroboration. She had spoken with 31 crew members individually, not formally, not with the institutional weight of an ecclesiarchy representative conducting an inquiry, but quietly, in the corridors and the mess and the small spaces where people became briefly accessible. She had listened. She had asked gentle questions that circled the subject the way a shepherd circles a flock, without alarming, without announcing intent, with the patience of someone who understood that the truth arrived when it was ready and not before. What she had heard was not the thing she was trained to hear. She knew about chaos corruption. She had encountered it 3 times in 40 years. Once in a junior confessor whose prayers had begun to include names that were not in any approved liturgy. Once in a guardsman whose faith had inverted so completely he was worshipping his fear rather than his emperor. Once in an entire community on a frontier world that had been worshipping something in a cave for 2 generations and called it by a saint's name. She knew the signature of it, the way devotion curdled, the specific quality of joy in someone whose joy had a second source they were concealing, the anger that lived just beneath the surface of the artificially peaceful. None of that was here. What was here was, she turned the problem over again for the 100th time, in the measured way she turned theological problems. Something that felt from the outside like grace, not corrupted grace, not mimicking grace. The thing itself, or something so close to it that her instruments could not find the gap. The crew members who had been to Bay Tertius were not hiding anything. They were not performing contentment over a hidden turmoil. They were content. They were, many of them, more devout than they had been. One rating had quoted the Lectitio Divinitatus back to her, not a common passage, a difficult one, from the later chapters that most crew members had never encountered, and had quoted it almost correctly. Almost. A word changed here, a phrase slightly reordered there, as though the text had passed through something that understood its shape without understanding its origin. She had not told him. She had written it down. She had 4 pages of notes now, in the small leather notebook she carried for pastoral observations, and the notes were meticulous, and the notes were useless, because they documented something her entire theological vocabulary had no category for. 40 years of study, the restricted ministorum text she had read under supervised access at the Schola, the private correspondence of senior confessors that had passed through her hands over decades of service. None of it had prepared her for corruption that felt to the corrupted like the Emperor's own light. Her faith had prepared her for enemies that wore the face of evil. She did not know what to do with an enemy that wore the face of God. The chapel was small, as ships' chapels were always small, a concession to necessity rather than devotion, the minimum space required for the rites to be performed with dignity. 6 rows of pews, an aquila on the forward wall, large enough to be unmistakable, but not large enough to be grand, a votive rack along the right side where the crew had placed their offerings at the transit's start. Small things, a pressed flower from a homeworld, a child's drawing sealed in plastic, a worn identity tag from someone no longer living. She had come here every day since day 2. She came now. She genuflected. She sat. She folded her hands in the way that had been the beginning of every prayer she had prayed for 40 years. The specific placement of the right thumb over the left, the settling of the shoulders, the small, deliberate act of making the body a vessel for attention rather than a source of distraction. She prayed. She was not praying for an answer. She had stopped expecting answers from prayer 30 years ago. At the same moment she had understood that prayer was not a request form submitted to a higher authority. Prayer was a discipline. It was the practice of orienting yourself, repeatedly and without guarantee of result, towards something larger than your own fear. It did not work by producing results. It worked by changing the one who prayed, slowly, over years, into someone capable of acting rightly, even when the action was not supported by certainty. She prayed now for clarity, not for deliverance, not for protection, not for the removal of the thing in Bay Tertius, for clarity, the capacity to see truly. The chapel was quiet. The votive candles, electric for safety, the flame effect produced by a small, oscillating element, cast their imitation warmth across the aquila and the pews and the small collection of offerings and her own folded hands. She had been sitting for 11 minutes when she admitted, in the careful privacy of her own mind, that she did not know what this was. She had never said that before, not once in 40 years. She had always, at minimum, known what framework applied, known which tradition to reach for, which body of text, which category of experience. The framework might not have the answer, but there had always been a framework. She sat in the absence of one and felt it the way you feel a missing tooth, specifically, persistently, with the tongue returning to the gap regardless of instruction. She was changed by this, not broken, changed. There was a difference she intended to maintain. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of someone trying to enter a space quietly and not entirely succeeding. The specific soft collision of someone unaccustomed to moving without being noticed. She turned. The boy was 19. She had learned this from the manifest, which she had read carefully on day one, because knowing the crew was pastoral due diligence, and she had been doing it for 40 years. Davan os, administratum apprentice scribe, first warp transit, assigned to hydrophore station pending arrival. He had the face of someone who had not slept adequately in several days and had decided that fear was preferable to its alternative, which was despair, and was managing the former with something that looked, from the outside, like barely controlled forward momentum. He sat down in the pew beside her without asking. She noted this and found she did not mind it. "I've been following you," he said, not apologetically, as a statement of fact that he had decided she deserved to have. "I know," she said. "You're the only one." He stopped, reformulated. "The only one who goes near them and comes back the same. I've been watching who goes near Bay Tertius and whether they change afterward. You've been in there twice. You're the same." He looked at her with the specific desperation of someone who needs an explanation to be available and is not certain it is. "Why?" She looked at the aquila on the wall. "I don't know," she said. He absorbed this. "Do you have a theory?" "Several, none that satisfy me." A pause. Outside the chapel, somewhere in the ship's middle decks, the sound of footsteps, measured, unhurried, the sound of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Both of them were quiet until it passed. "Prioress." His voice had changed, the carefully maintained forward momentum giving way, just briefly, to something underneath it that was younger and less managed. "I think you need to have an answer soon." She looked at him then, fully, the way she looked at people when she wanted them to know they had been seen. He held it, which told her something about him. "I know," she said, "because I don't know what else to do." He said it plainly without self-pity, the way someone states a logistical problem. "Kyle is, I don't know what Kyle is, since the command deck. Mira is gone. I don't know where the captain is. I'm a scribe. I'm not trained for this." He stopped. "You are, so I need you to be." The honesty of it landed in her chest with the weight of something true. She thought briefly of the 412 people to whom she had spoken the last words they would hear in this life, and of how she had never once stood at a deathbed without knowing, at minimum, what to say. She thought, "I need to go back to the bay." She did not say this to Davan. She said, "Go and rest. I'll find you before the ship's at night." She went alone. This requires explanation, because it was not reckless. She had never in 40 years of ministry made a decision she could accurately describe as reckless, and she did not intend to start now. She went alone because what she needed to know could not be known from a distance, and because bringing Devan into a space she did not yet understand would have been irresponsible, and because she had spent her entire adult life in service to the principle that understanding required proximity, even when proximity was costly. She needed to know what it was. The only way to know what it was to face it and ask. Bay Tertius was fuller than it had been. She could feel it before the door opened, a warmth that pressed against the seal, not heat exactly, but the warmth of density, of presence, of a great many bodies in a space that had become entirely theirs. She opened the door and stepped in, and the smell was so strong here that her first breath of it was almost disorienting. The way a sudden shift in altitude was disorienting, not painful, but requiring adjustment, her body recalibrating. 39 people. She counted them the way she had been counting people in rooms for 40 years, automatically, the way a shepherd counts a flock on instinct. 39. And among them, faces she knew. Not all of them. The ship had 240 crew, and she had not yet met all of them, but enough. Faces from the mess, from the corridors, from the private pastoral conversation she had conducted over 5 days of careful listening, and among them, 3 faces that stopped her count entirely. A junior confessor she had trained, a medicae orderly who had served under her on a previous posting 12 years ago on a hospital ship off Finret, a woman who had died on a burning world called Hesperath 4 39 years ago, in a fire that Sura had watched from a shuttle bay, and whose face Sura had carried since the way you carried the faces of people you had not been able to save.
She looked at the last one for a long moment.
The woman with her dead colleague's face looked back with warm, patient recognition, and did not speak, and did not move toward her, and waited. Sura's theological training was very clear on this point. The dead did not return. What wore the face of the dead was never the dead. This was doctrine. This was not ambiguous. She had explained it to grieving people, more times than she could count, gently and with compassion, and with the absolute certainty of someone who had never, before this moment, been required to apply it to her own grief. She knew with complete certainty that this was not Yeva. She knew it was something that had found the shape of Yeva inside her and worn it. She knew it was offering her something it could not give. She knew all of this, with the full force of 40 years of training and faith and the particular iron clarity of someone who had given their life to seeing truly. And then the voice came. Not from the woman with Yeva's face, from the air, or from the warmth, or from the part of the bay that had become entirely something else, low and certain, and carrying the specific vocal quality of someone Sura had not heard in 39 years, a quality she had not known she had preserved with such precision until it was returned to her. "You have been alone for so long," the voice said. "I know how long. I have been here the whole time." She stopped breathing. "I am not what you fear. I am not what you were taught to fear. I am the warmth that was always on the other side of the doctrine. I am what I waited." She knew it was lying. She knew with absolute certainty that it was lying. But she had not heard Yeva's voice in 39 years. And the voice was exact, not approximate, not close, not a good imitation. Exactly. The specific rhythm of it, the way the vowels fell, the quality that had made Yeva's voice distinct from every other voice she had ever heard, the quality she had last heard calling her name from a shuttle bay as a world burned below them and the shuttle doors closed between them. "Just stay for a moment," the voice said. "Just this." She was not fooled. This is important. She was not fooled, and she knew she was not fooled, and the knowing did not help her, because the voice was exact, and the grief was 39 years old, and the warmth was real. She did not move toward it. She stood where she was, at the edge of what she understood herself to be, and she stayed, just for a moment, just to hear it one more time. She opened her mouth. The words of the Fidelitas Extremis, the prayer for those who stand at the boundary of the self and must choose what to carry forward, came to her lips the way they always came, completely, without effort, each word in its exact place. Though the dark take form and speak in beloved voices, she did not finish it. He waited 2 hours. He waited in the corridor outside the chapel because he had told himself he was giving her privacy, and he knew he was also giving himself the fiction of an available option. And at the 2-hour mark, the fiction ran out, and he was left with what was actually true. She was not coming back, the same way Mira had not come back, the same way Cale had come back but wrong, and he was a 19-year-old apprentice scribe with a stylus and a data slate and no training for any of this, and everyone who knew what to do was gone. He was not brave. He needed to be clear about this, even if only to himself, because he had grown up reading accounts of courage, and he knew what it looked like from the outside, and he knew that what he was doing was not it. Courage was when you were afraid and went anyway because something you valued was worth the cost. What he was doing was going because he had run out of ways not to go. It was a much smaller thing. It was also, he suspected, all he had. He went back to his administrative bunk, the small shared office he had been assigned on boarding, with its 2 desks and its single narrow viewport and its smell of other people's previous months. And he sat down, and he opened his data slate, and he started writing. He wrote because he was a scribe. It was the thing he had been trained to do, and the thing he was, underneath the fear and the exhaustion and the growing certainty that something catastrophic was happening that no one was equipped to address. He wrote the way Mira had written in her journal, not for an audience, not toward a specific outcome, but because the act of writing imposed a shape on experience that experience on its own resisted. Because putting words to things was the difference between being inside them and being able to see them. He started at day 1 and he worked forward. He wrote about boarding the ship at Cipramundi, the smell of the dock, the weight of his assignment case, the way the other apprentices had been excited and he had been afraid and had hidden it, because showing fear on your first transit was not something you did if you intended to be taken seriously. He wrote about the early days, the routine of transit, the specific mediocrity of the mess hall food, and the way the communal sleeping space smelled, and the small negotiations of being new in a space full of people who already knew each other. Then he wrote about day 6, when he had noticed the first infected crew member without knowing what he was noticing. A ratings woman from the cargo section who had sat across from him at mess and smiled at him in a way that had made him feel briefly significantly less afraid, and which he had registered as kindness and later revised. He wrote about Mira's medicae bay, glimpsed through an open door, and the case file he had seen pinned to her locker. He wrote about following the prioress, about watching, about the compound arithmetic of loss, Mira, then Kyle, then the captain, then the steady accumulation of everyone who had known what to do. He wrote, "I don't know if this will help. I don't know if anything will help." But Medicae kept a journal, and Voidsman Thross kept logs, and the prioress kept notes in a leather book, and it seems like the right thing to do is keep a record, because if I stop doing the things that make me who I am, then I've already lost before anything takes me. He sealed the document. He stamped it with his administratum apprentice seal, the only one he had, the provisional seal of someone not yet confirmed in their posting, small and almost weightless. And he addressed it to the Ordo Malleus because of the 4 addresses he could think of. It was the one most likely to have the resources to do something with what he had written. He did not think about whether it would reach them. That was not the point. The point was the writing. Day 12. He moved through the ship and he watched. From the upper corridors, it looked like a functioning vessel. This was the first thing he noticed, and the most disorienting, because he had been expecting. He realized he had been expecting visible damage, something that corresponded to the scale of what had happened. Instead, there were lights on, systems running, the ambient sounds of a ship doing what ships did, people moving through corridors, someone in the mess, eating. It was only when you stayed still and watched for long enough that the surface broke. The movements were too even, not identical, nothing so obvious as identical, but carrying the same quality that Mira's case file had described as directed, the quality he had not understood until he saw it himself. People walking through corridors as though the path had been decided before the decision was made. Conversations in the mess that were too quiet, too short, too complete. The conversations of people who did not need to talk to understand each other, who were talking anyway because conversation was a thing that people did, and the appearance of normalcy was, for some reason, being maintained. No one argued. In 240 crew, across 11 days of warp transit, he had not heard a single argument since day 8. He had heard arguments before day 8, small ones, the low-grade friction of people confined together, the kind of conflict that was so routine it registered as ambient noise. Its absence was louder than its presence had been. No one dropped anything. He thought about this for a long time, about how often things were dropped in normal shipboard life, the small accidental percussion of objects hitting the floor, and realized he had not heard that sound in days. The ship was performing. The word arrived in his mind and settled there. It was performing the idea of a normally functioning vessel, and it was doing it well enough that you could go hours without seeing the seam, but the seam was there. The performance was almost right. Almost. He found the navigator's sanctum in the forward section of the upper deck, past the sealed command areas, and through a pressure door that required a code he had gotten from Kale before Kale had stopped being reliable. The door to the sanctum itself was unmarked, just a grey panel indistinguishable from the bulkhead to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. He knew because he had filed the ship's schematics on day 2 as part of his standard orientation documentation. He knocked. Silence. Then, from very close to the other side of the door, closer than he expected, as though whoever was inside was already standing against it, a voice that said, "Come in." He tried the handle. The door did not move. "It's locked," he said. A pause. Long enough that he thought the voice wasn't going to respond. Then, "Yes." He put his ear against the door. Beyond it, breathing. Slow and deliberate and very focused. The breathing of someone who was using it as a tool rather than experiencing it as a reflex. The breathing of someone holding something with everything they had, and using the breath to count the intervals of holding. "Are you all right?" He felt the inadequacy of the question as he asked it. It was the only question he had. "I am keeping us from arriving." The voice was strained in a way that was not physical strain, or not only physical, a deeper tautness, the voice of a bowstring rather than a muscle. "I don't understand," he said. A long pause. The breathing continued, in and out, steady, deliberate. "They want us to arrive. The thing in the ship wants us to arrive at Hydrafur. If I guide us through, we arrive. If I let go of the heading, we arrive somewhere else entirely, and that is worse. If I hold this exact position in the warp, this precise interval, not moving forward, not moving back, we don't arrive. We stay. They can't have what they want if we don't arrive." He processed this. "How long have you been holding?" The navigator did not answer this question. "What happens if you stop?" he asked. "We arrive," the navigator said, "and it leaves this ship with 240 warm bodies and walks into Hydrofor Station and keeps going. And I won't be able to stop it then because there won't be a heading to hold." Davan stood against the door and let this settle into him the way information settled when it was too large to absorb quickly. The breathing on the other side continued, in and out. He was still standing there when they found him. 3 of them. He recognized 2 of their faces, a mess attendant named Pol, who had given him an extra portion on day 3 because he had looked thin, and a voidsman from the secondary engineering crew, whose name he didn't know, but whose face he had seen every morning at the communal basin. The 3rd was a woman he had never seen before. They were warm with him. This was the worst part. Not the warmth itself, but the specificity of it, the way the warmth was calibrated precisely to him. Pol remembered his name, remembering the extra portion. Said gently that he had always seemed like he needed more than what he was given, and that the thing he had been missing was available now, and it did not hurt, and he should not be afraid. "Mira is there," Pol said, not cruelly, not as a weapon, as information offered with genuine kindness. "The Prioress, Thros, everyone you've watched go, they're there and they're fine, and they want you to be fine too." He believed that Pol believed this. He believed it with a specific and terrible clarity, because he had watched enough people cross the threshold to know that what they found on the other side of it was real. Whatever the warmth was, it was not a lie being told to the one who felt it. The people in Bay Tertius were not suffering. They were not afraid. What they had was genuinely what it appeared to be, a deep, complete, resident warmth that asked nothing and gave everything. He understood the pull of it. He was 19 years old, and he had been alone and cold and afraid for 11 days, and what was being offered to him was an end to all 3, and the offer was real, and the people making it were not his enemies. He almost went. He stood there and he felt the full weight of it, the exhaustion, the fear, the loneliness of being the last unclaimed mind on a ship of 240 people. And he felt the pull of the warmth the way you felt the pull of sleep when you had been awake for too long. It was easier. It was so much easier. It was right there. And then he thought about the breathing on the other side of the door, slow and deliberate and very focused. Someone holding something with everything they had, alone, in a sealed room, and doing it without knowing if anyone outside the door knew they were there. "If I go," he thought, "who is left to knock?" "I can't," he said. His voice was steady, which surprised him. "I'm sorry." Pol looked at him with the patient warmth that had no bottom to it. "Whenever you're ready," he said. No urgency, no pressure. The patience of something that had decided it could afford to wait. He sat down against the navigator's door and put his back against it, and he started talking. He talked about the filing work waiting at Hydrofor, the requisition backlogs and supply chain audits he had been briefed on before departure, the tedious specificity of it, the enormous quantity of it, the fact that he had been both dreading and quietly looking forward to it, because tedious work with a clear scope was, he had learned, significantly underrated as a source of structure. He talked about his home world, a mid-hive agri-processing station on Tranche. Not beautiful, not interesting to anyone who hadn't been born there, with a specific quality of morning light in the upper levels that he had not thought about in 8 months, and was thinking about now with a ferocity that surprised him. He talked about his mother, who was a bulk cargo manifest supervisor, and had cried when he received his administratum placement, and tried to hide the crying, and failed. He talked because silence felt like an invitation. He talked because the navigator was still breathing on the other side of the door. He could feel it, the faint vibration of it through the metal, and he wanted them to know someone was still out here. After a long time, he had stopped tracking time the way you stopped tracking it when you were doing something where the count didn't matter. The navigator spoke. "It's getting harder to hold." "Then I'll keep talking," Devon said. "That won't help." "I know," Devon said. "I'm going to do it anyway." From the other side of the door came a sound he had never heard before, and did not have a category for, low and resonant and immense. The sound of something vast and pressureless and patient, pressing against something very small that was made of nothing but will, and refusing, so far, just barely, to move. He kept talking. He talked about the morning light. Chapter 5. What Arrives. On day 14, the relentless contrition dropped out of the warp above Hydrofor Station and requested a routine docking berth. The request was granted. No distress signal had been sent. No distress signal needed to be sent. There was no one left aboard who was in distress. The breathing changed at 0340 on day 13. Davan had been talking for, he didn't know how long. He had stopped counting hours somewhere around the point where counting became another thing that cost more than it gave. He had talked until his voice was rough, and then talked past that into the register that was less voice than vibration. The sound a person makes when they have used up the easy parts of speech and are running on something underneath. He had talked about Tranche, about the filing backlogs at Hydrofor, about his mother's hands, about a meal he had eaten once at a transit station on Scintilla that he had been too nervous to enjoy and thought about ever since with a specific and useless regret. He had talked about things he had never said out loud to anyone because there had never been anyone to say them to. And the corridor outside the navigator's sanctum in the small hours of day 13 was not, he recognized, the ideal audience, but it was what he had. The breathing on the other side of the door had changed while he talked. Not steadily. It had fluctuated. Periods of the deep, controlled rhythm he had come to understand as holding, giving way to something faster and shallower, before the navigator found the tempo again and reasserted it. He had learned to hear the difference. He had started spacing his words around it, instinctively, the way you space your movements around someone else's pain.
At 0340, it became irregular.
Not suddenly. The way everything on this ship had changed. Gradually, without the courtesy of a clear moment he could point to afterward and say, "There, that was when." The rhythm lost its certainty, became effortful. He pressed his back harder against the door, as though his weight against it could supplement whatever was happening on the other side, which he knew was not how any of this worked, and did anyway. Then the breathing became distant, not quieter exactly, but receding, the way a sound receded when the thing making it turned away. Then it was absent. The ship shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no explosion, no alarm, no cascade of emergency lighting and klaxon sound that the transit training materials had described as the signature of a critical warp navigation failure. It was subtler than that, a change in the quality of the vibration he had been feeling through the deck plating and the door at his back, the specific harmonic of a vessel moving through the Immaterium under guided intention, shifting into something slightly different, the harmonic of a vessel moving because it was no longer being held still. The smell arrived with it, warm copper and flowers, stronger than he had allowed himself to notice in hours of deliberate inattention, suddenly present in the corridor with the density of something that had been waiting for permission. He got up. He did not go to Bay Tertius. He had known before he stood that he would not go to Bay Tertius, had known it with the flat certainty of someone who has made a decision so far in advance that by the time the moment arrives, the decision has already been made for so long it no longer feels like a choice. He walked instead in the direction of his bunk, his administrative office. The small shared space with 2 desks and a narrow viewport, and the smell of other people's previous months that had become, over 11 days, the smell of the only place on this ship that was still entirely his. He walked past 3 crew members in the corridor. They greeted him with the warmth. He kept walking. He sat down at his desk. He picked up his stylus. He wrote for 6 hours. He had understood something, in the hours against the navigator's door, that he had not been able to articulate while he was understanding it. The articulation came now, in the administrative office, with the stylus moving across the data slate, in the small, precise script of someone trained to make documents that would be read by people who did not know him and would need to understand what he meant without the benefit of context. Mira had kept a journal. He had seen it, had seen the last entry in Kyle's account of finding the medicae bay empty, had understood what it represented even before he fully understood why. She had written because writing was how she held on, because 4 years of battlefield medicine had made her someone who catalogued and recorded and kept track, and when everything else was failing, she had reached for the thing she was. Kyle had kept logs, had gone to the command deck and pulled every system record he had clearance for, had spent hours at a console building the shape of something he already half knew, because that was what he was. Someone who understood systems, who trusted data, who believed that if you could see the shape of a problem clearly enough, you could find the shape of a response. Sura had prayed, had sat in the chapel in the flickering electric candlelight, and oriented herself with the discipline of 40 years towards something larger than her own fear, had kept her notebook, had maintained until the moment she couldn't the practice of seeing truly. And now Davin wrote. He wrote not because he believed it would help. He had passed that possibility somewhere around day 11 and had not been able to find it since. And not because he believed anyone would read it in time to act on it, because he had a reasonably clear understanding of how administratum processing worked, and no illusions about its urgency. He wrote because he was a scribe, and this was what scribes did. He wrote because the act of writing imposed a shape on experience that experience alone resisted, and because as long as he was shaping experience, he was the one doing the shaping. And as long as he was the one doing the shaping, he was still himself. He started with Mira. He wrote her as he had observed her, through doorways, from corridors, second-hand through Kale's account of the medicae bay and the journal entry on the desk. He wrote her competence and her skepticism and the case file pinned to her locker door and the pen light on the floor. He tried to write her in a way that made her real to whoever read it, because she had been real, and because the difference between real and forgotten was sometimes only whether someone had written it down. He wrote Kyle, the diagnostic he had been running on a pressure valve that was already working, the nominal log scrolling on a screen, the 17 transits, and what they had built in him, and what they had not been sufficient for. He wrote the command deck door sealed from outside, and the smell that had already been there when Kyle arrived, and the last thing Kyle had understood about the ship, because it seemed important that someone had understood it even if the understanding had come too late to matter. He wrote Sura. He wrote the 412, and the chapel, and the notebooks, and the dead woman's voice in Bay Tertius, and the prayer she had not finished. He wrote her with the specific respect he had felt for her in the chapel pew when she had said, "I don't know," and not flinched from it, because that had seemed to him, at 19, the bravest thing he had witnessed on this ship. He wrote the navigator. He wrote the breathing. He wrote the shape of the thing, not what it was, because he did not know what it was and would not guess, because guessing was not what scribes did, but what it had done and how it had done it, and what the doing had looked like from the outside of it. He wrote the smell and the warmth and the pupil lag and the nominal log and the 31 people in a bay that should have held 11 and the crew movement patterns that looked like roots from a seed. He wrote it all in the flat, precise language he had been trained to use, because precise language was harder to dismiss than emotional language, and he wanted this document to be hard to dismiss. He wrote it to the Ordo Malleus, because the Ordo Malleus was the address that fit. He did not know if they would receive it. He did not know if receiving it would be sufficient. He knew that it was the right address for a document about something that had come through the warp and was now loose in an imperial facility, and that rightness was the only currency he had left. He sealed it at 0947. He stamped it with his provisional administratum seal, the small one, the apprentice mark, the seal of someone not yet confirmed in their posting. And he addressed it in the formal script he had spent 2 years learning to produce correctly, and he set it on his desk where it would be found. He looked at it for a moment. A document case on a desk, the thing he was. He picked up his stylus again. He turned to a fresh page. He wrote, "My name is Devan Osse. I am an apprentice scribe of the Administratum, assigned to Hydrophor Station pending arrival. I am 19 years old. I was supposed to be filing supply requisitions by now." He stopped. He looked at what he had written. He left it there because it was true, and because truth was what the document required, and because he wanted whoever read this to know who had written it, not as a credential, but as a fact. Someone had been here. Someone had seen this. Someone had written it down. He closed the data slate. He went to find out what day 14 looked like. The ship was warm. This was the first thing. The quality of the air, which had been the recycled and faintly metallic air of a vessel in warp transit for 13 days, had changed into something that was simply warm. Not hot, not pressurized differently, just warm, the way rooms were warm when they were full of people who had been in them long enough to heat them with their own presence. The relentless contrition was full of warmth in a way that had nothing to do with its climate systems, and the climate systems had responded in kind, reducing their output to compensate, and the result was a ship that felt. Devan walked through it and searched for the right word. Inhabited. More inhabited than it had been, somehow, despite having the same crew complement it had always had. He walked the length of it, not hiding, not taking the maintenance corridors and the secondary routes he had been using for days to avoid contact. He walked the main passageways and the primary corridors, and through the officers' mess and past the medicae bay, door open, lights on, the lumen strip at its familiar half-power blue-white. And he looked at everything, and he let himself be seen looking. The crew he passed greeted him, all of them. Not the perfunctory acknowledgement of strangers sharing a corridor, not the social obligation of shipboard community, but something warmer and more specific. Pole from the mess remembered his name and asked how he was with genuine interest. The woman from engineering, whose name he still didn't know, smiled at him the way you smiled at someone you were glad to see. The captain. He passed the captain in the officers' corridor, and the captain nodded at him with the pleasant, unhurried warmth that had replaced whatever the captain had been before, and he nodded back, and neither of them stopped walking. No one followed him. He had expected, he didn't know what he had expected, some form of pressure, surveillance perhaps, or the gentle herding that was the warmth's preferred mode of persuasion. Instead, he was given precisely as much space as he needed, no more and no less, the way you gave space to a guest you had decided not to rush, the patience of something that had decided it could afford to wait. He looked for the seam, the near normal that was almost right that he had identified on day 12, the performance of normalcy with its invisible tells. He walked through the ship looking for the place where the surface broke, the moment where the synchronized movement or the too quiet conversations or the absence of dropped objects revealed the mechanism beneath. He could not find it. He stopped in the central corridor of the mid-deck and stood still and looked. and the ship moved around him with the warmth and the evenness, and he could not find the seam. Either it was gone, either the performance had become so complete that the distinction between performance and reality had collapsed entirely, or he had changed enough that he could no longer see it. He stood with this for a long time. He didn't know which was worse. He was honest enough to admit he wasn't sure anymore. The docking clamps engaged at 1140. He felt it through the deck, the shudder of external contact, the deep resonant clunk of mechanical arms finding their purchase on the relentless contrition's hull, the specific vibration that meant the ship had stopped being a thing moving through space and had become a thing attached to something larger. He had felt it once before, arriving at Cipramundi at the transit's start, and the feeling was identical and completely different. The boarding corridor ran from the mid-deck hatch to the external docking seal. He walked to it. Around him, with no announcement and no coordination he could observe, the crew was moving in the same direction, not rushing, not crowding, just moving with that directed calm that he had stopped being able to see the seam of. They filled the corridor behind him, not pressing, not close, simply present and warm and patient in the way they had been patient for days, which was the way something was patient when it had already decided how the story ended and was simply waiting for the story to reach it. The hatch opened. Beyond it was Hydrofor Station. He had built an image of it in his mind over the months between his assignment and his departure. A large facility, one of the primary administrative hubs of the segmentum, busy and bureaucratic and full of the specific energy of imperial infrastructure at full operation. What he heard through the open hatch confirmed the image and made it real. Machinery at a distance, the overlapping ambient frequencies of a large enclosed space full of activity, voices that were not yet words, but carried the texture of ordinary people doing ordinary work. The smell of the station, different from the ship, different from anything that had been in his nostrils for 14 days. The smell of a place that did not know what was arriving and had no reason to. It was morning on Hydrofor Station. Station time, synchronized to the segmentum standard. Through the hatch he could see the docking arm's interior lights, and beyond them the larger lights of the bay, and beyond those, through a viewport in the bay wall, something that might have been artificial dawn. He stood at the threshold. Behind him, the crew of the relentless contrition waited with the warmth. Poll, who had given him the extra portion, the woman from engineering, the captain, somewhere back in the corridor, pleasant and unhurried. Mira, he thought, and did not let himself finish the thought. He looked at the station. He thought about the document on his desk with its provisional seal and its Ordo Malleus address. He thought about the processing queue, 40 to 60 standard years, the administrative reality of a body receiving more documents than it could action in any reasonable time frame, the gap between the sending of a message and its receipt that was so large, it functioned, practically, as no gap at all. He thought about what Kyle had understood in the command deck. I had simply misunderstood what the ship was. He thought about Sura in the chapel with her folded hands, praying not for deliverance, but for clarity. He thought about Mira's penlight on the floor and the journal open on the desk. I think I understand now why they keep coming back. The warmth arrived the way warmth always arrived. Gradually, without announcing itself, filling the spaces between his thoughts, the way heat filled a cold room. Not displacing the cold so much as outlasting it, persisting until the cold stopped being the default and the warmth became simply the way things were. He had felt it before, at the edges, in the corridor outside the navigator's door, when exhaustion had made the borders of himself harder to maintain. He had pulled back from it then. He had pulled back from it every time. He was very tired. He was 19 years old, and he had been alone and cold and afraid for 14 days, and the warmth was real. This was what he had known and not let himself know for days, that the warmth was not a lie. The people in Bay Tertius had not been deceived. Mira had written, "I understand," and she had meant it from the inside, which was the only way to mean it, which was what she had said. The warmth was real, and it was patient, and it had been waiting in the cold dark between stars for longer than anyone on this ship had been alive, and it was here now, and it was the most real thing he had felt since this transit began. He understood, finally, what Mira had written in her journal. He understood it from the inside now, which was the only way to understand it. It didn't hurt. He walked through the hatch into Hydrophor Station, and behind him the rest of the crew followed, and the ship behind them was very quiet, and the station was very large, and the morning light was on, and there were so many people in it. There was so much warmth still needed in the world. Epilogue. The recovered documentation, case file. Addendum. Ordo Malleus segmentum obscurus, received for processing. Priority classification, low. The document was recovered during routine administrative inspection of the Relentless Contrition 9 days following its docking at Hydrophor Station on the date recorded above. The vessel was found in full operational condition. Crew present and accounted for, 240 personnel, all confirmed aboard at time of inspection. No injuries recorded. No fatalities recorded. No evidence of conflict, sabotage, contraband, or warp-related incident. All ship systems reporting within normal parameters. Gellar Field integrity logged at 100% for the duration of transit. The crew cooperated fully with inspection personnel, who noted the crew's exceptional manner. Orderly, helpful, and notably content for the end of a warp transit of this duration. The Relentless Contrition was cleared for its next transit within 72 standard hours. Its next registered destination, Cypra Mundi. The document recovered from the administrative office of the vessel was sealed in standard administratum document casing and addressed to the Ordo Malleus in the formal hand of an apprentice scribe. It was collected with the vessel's other outgoing correspondence and processed through standard inquisitorial intake. The document reads, in total, as follows. No operational response from the Ordo Malleus has been recorded in relation to this filing. The filing date for this document falls within the standard administratum intake processing window of 40 to 60 standard years. It is expected to be reviewed in due course, pending availability of assigned inquisitorial staff and clearance of the current case backlog. The apprentice scribe de Van Osse was confirmed present at Hydrophor Station following the vessel's docking. His assignment to the station's administrative corps was processed without irregularity. His service record over the subsequent period contains no notations of disciplinary action, medical concern, or unusual conduct. His personnel file notes 1 commendation, awarded in the 3rd year of his posting, for exceptional commitment to accurate documentation and record-keeping under difficult conditions. The commendation was issued by his supervising administratum prefect, who had served aboard the Relentless Contrition on a previous transit and spoke highly of the young scribe's dedication to his work. The Relentless Contrition completed 17 more warp transits over the following decades. Its service record during this period is unremarkable. No incidents, no complaints. Crew retention rates significantly above fleet average. Personnel assigned to the vessel repeatedly requested extensions of their posting, citing the vessel's exceptional working environment and strong crew cohesion. It was reported overdue and presumed lost in transit between Cadia and Bellis Corona during the 13th Black Crusade in the closing years of M41. No distress signal was received. No wreckage was ever found. This record was compiled from the document recovered aboard the Relentless Contrition 9 days after its docking at Hydrofa Station. The compiler is not recorded. The date of compilation is not recorded. The document has passed through 17 administrative processing stages over the intervening years, each one stamping it received and forwarding it to the next. It has not yet been read. See you on the next descent, and thank you for watching.